Hello, and thank you for attending my talk, Co-Designing Self-Identification for the Government of Canada. I'm Andee Pittman, and I am a lead human-centered designer in the Office of the Chief Human Resources Officer in the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. If you missed the content warning, please be advised that this talk references material that uses outdated and harmful language, in particular to Indigenous people of the land we call Canada, and racialized and ethnic groups who are marginalized and discriminated against. I'm recording this video on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And I am recording this on our country's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, or Orange Shirt Day. And to that end, I'm wearing an orange shirt. This is a day to honor the victims and survivors of residential schools and other colonial institutions that systematically sought to eradicate the Indigenous people of Turtle Island. I invite this international audience to recognize the atrocities committed to Indigenous people all around the world and to work together to bring them justice and to take care of our planet for generations to come. Before we get started, I wanted to ask you a question. How many of you have self-disclosed a part of your identity on a questionnaire? Identities like being a person with a disability or a woman. You may have done this when applying for a job or for organizational demographic studies, usually for the purpose of applying employment equity measures. For those that have self-identified, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being awful and 10 being awesome, how was that experience of checking those boxes? If you feel comfortable, put it in the chat. Because this is pre-recorded, I cannot see your responses. But from our research during the Self-Identification Modernization Project, we found that self-identifying as someone who belongs to an identity group that has historical or current reasons for why they require equity measures can be both painful and scary. Painful due to the reminders of being marginalized and discriminated against, and fear of repercussions for being known to self-identify and being further discriminated against and stigmatized. My job at the Office of the Chief Human Resources Officer was to design the research approach to the Self-Identification Modernization Project and to lead the qualitative research to inform the design of the new self-ID questionnaire. To make this experience safe and inclusive and as effective as possible meant that our approach had to align to those outcomes that we were seeking. But how to do this in a government context? This was not as easy as I originally thought. So in this talk, I will give you a little bit more context to self-identification and employment equity in the Government of Canada. I'll show you a bit about the current questionnaire, the objectives of our project, and I will describe how I achieved co-design at scale by achieving both depth and breadth, and I'll share with you final insight for this project. In the Government of Canada, self-identification is a workforce demographic survey that produces representation statistics for the 4 designated groups under the Employment Equity Act, and that is Indigenous people, people with disabilities, what is referred to as visible minorities, and women. We determine representation through establishing representation benchmarks, i.e. goals. We do this through using population census data and filtering it through conditions that are intended to make the benchmark more accurate, like applying citizenship status, since non-citizens are unable to work in the Government of Canada. The questionnaire that administers the self-identification survey has not been changed in over 25 years, so you can imagine that it was behind the times. For example, the preamble of the questionnaire has a very limited explanation for the purpose of self-identification and how an employee's data is managed. It is only covered in 1 bullet and does not speak to key information about data management practices. The question for Indigenous identity uses outdated language in the Canadian context, with no way to further specify Indigenous identity when there's so much diversity within First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The question on visible minority It is also outdated language. And the options to choose from conflate race and ethnicity. And the options depict the bias of the issues we see today, where we have 7 options for Asian identities, but only 1 option for people of African descent, all grouped together, labeled as Black. So our objectives were to use a mixed method, inclusive and ethical approach to achieve both depth and breadth, to solve barriers for employees to self-identify and the system-level barriers for the effectiveness of self-identification. So how did we achieve depth? Starting with building a team. There was recognition that new skills were needed to tackle such a deeply difficult project. So the project temporarily transitioned from the policy and program owners to our team, the brand new research and experimentation team. The team was equipped to have a multidisciplinary research approach, including myself as a human-centered designer, a sociologist, a psychologist, and behavioral insights practitioners. And as far as I know, this is pretty rare in government. So this was a big factor for our success in achieving co-design at scale. Our research plan was to start with a literature review and an environmental scan to situate ourselves in the context of self-identification and employment equity. Then we conducted some preliminary interviews and surveys to further refine our hypotheses. Then we established advisory project panels. These helped inform our co-design and engaged with us throughout the research and design phases. Our 3 advisory panels are on the right-hand side. We had the Human Resources Advisory Panel, which was made up of human resources professionals who were responsible for administering self-identification in their departments. The Employment Equity Advisory Project Panel, which represented key leads in the employment equity employee networks across the Government of Canada. And finally, the Corporate Advisory Panel, which was made up of key stakeholders that had functional authority or responsibility over different aspects of self-identification. Then we were to get depth through a 3-week co-design engagement to create prototypes for solutions. And then we were to conduct behavioral insights trials to quantify our results, and then refine the questionnaire with the broader employee community. So the design of the co-design, it was 3 weeks full-time with 25 employees, and they were randomly selected for the most diversity. And we covered not just the 4 designated groups, but also equity-seeking groups like 2S LGBTQIA+, and non-employment equity groups, and those who wished not to self-identify for our project. We also considered location of work across the country, different departments, profession, and level. It was fully remote and online because it was the early days of the pandemic, which posed a lot of challenges for accessibility. However, we were able to do our research and figure out the best way to host that experience. And that is a whole nother talk for another time. We also had to consider linguistic inclusion because Canada has 2 official languages, English and French. So we ran 2 groups parallel to allow for equivalent experiences for both groups. And participants were to use design thinking to solve problems that they thought were key to improving self-identification based on their own primary research and our pre-research. And we wanted to leave it open-ended to allow to learn what their mental models were, what their values were, and where they saw the biggest leverage points. For conducting the engagement, being trauma-informed was key, as I'm sure everyone in this audience knows. Some things that we did were to provide a care package at the onset that included mental health resources and an outline of the program to set expectations. We had conversations as a facilitator team before the day and after the day to ground ourselves and align approaches to any difficult situations and to monitor participants' engagement and wellness throughout. And we also did this with participants, checking in at the beginning and at the end of the day. We taught design thinking in the morning and then would apply that in the afternoon. And once they had problem statements, they formed teams based on these. The prototypes that came out of this engagement spanned the entire ecosystem. We had prototypes on the questionnaire itself and other areas in the ecosystem. The integration with the advisory project panels helped to expand the reach of the co-design as they participated in the research and provided feedback on prototype presentations. So there were several key design innovations on the questionnaire. The preamble covered key questions that employees had for how their information is kept safe. The Indigenous question to be updated and to allow for greater distinction and self-determination. The visible minority question transforms into 2 different questions on race and ethnicity, and the inclusion of a new open-ended question. And other prototypes provided solutions to legislation and policies, accountability measures, and information and communications across the Government of Canada. So here's the latest version of the questionnaire. For the preamble, it asks questions instead of plain headers and provides more complete information. There are 2 key questions that I'm displaying. Why are we asking for this information? And who is allowed to access your self-identification information? But there are more questions that cover the breadth of the data management practices. For the Indigenous question, one of the Indigenous participants identified how important it was to have a distinctions-based approach in alignment with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, but also the need for self-determination. So they added open text fields for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis options that would enable the freedom of input. Participants found that the most dignified way to address race was to recognize it as a separate question and define it as such, to ensure that we say it is not based on science or biological differences and has significant consequences for people's lives. And for the ethnicity question, it was important to still include ethnicity because not only is it still a way by which discrimination occurs, but it is more accurate and self-determined. And for the open-ended question, one participant knew that one of the best ways to give power back to employees during a difficult exercise such as this was to allow them to self-identify in their own words. So it is a completely free-form open text box. We tested this questionnaire in a randomized control trial, and we found that there was a 30% increase in the trust of the management of their self-identification information. There was a 65% increase in those that reported their identity is captured by the new questionnaire, an 88% increase in the comprehension of the purpose of self-identification, and a 75% increase in the intent to self-identify. Additional meaningful wins being co-designed by employees was key to getting the initial questionnaire design approved. And many participants expressed using design thinking in their jobs. And one employee actually started working in the Center for Diversity and Inclusion, which are the policy and program owners of self-identification, which is where I now work. And the results from this experience are informing the work that is currently happening to update the Employment Equity Act, that old piece of legislation that guides the current questionnaire. But now, to achieve breadth, our advisory project panels helped us through the pre-research and the co-design phase, but then grew in scope to include more engagements with key stakeholders and other employment equity networks and employees in the Government of Canada. Over time, the questionnaire had more interventions from partners. And as a new public servant in a team that was not overly familiar with developing digital products in a government context, we were not expecting these interventions. We ran into interventions from our communications and privacy colleagues and the department responsible for statistics. And looking back, these probably should have been foreseeable, but I will share a bit more about them and how we maintained our innovations while meeting the needs of these key decision makers. Communications did not agree with our preamble. They thought it was too long, and asking in a question format was not considered good user experience. We worked with them to condense the preamble to achieve as plain and clear language as possible, but we kept headers in a question format. Then privacy. The key challenge was the inclusion of open text fields for each question, including the Indigenous question and the free-form open text. There is a privacy risk for over-collecting information that's not being used for the purpose of self-identification. But using co-design proved its importance to the program's objectives, and we were able to keep all open text fields. However, we limited the character count to protect the employee's best interest of not over-collecting information. And our statistics department challenged some of our work because it wasn't exactly how they collected information in the census. That's the basis for creating our benchmarks. Although we could still map the data, we iterated where we believed it would make a positive difference. For example, some of the racial groups changed. In the meantime, we continued to work with our privacy colleagues to complete a privacy impact assessment, and this ended up taking 2 years. In the meantime, our statistics department developed new data standards for diversity and inclusion, and they did not align with our questionnaire. The deputy ministers caught this in our final checks before launching the new questionnaire, and so we had to go back and update our work. And so the questionnaire evolves to this day, or the day that I'm recording this anyways. Our first launch date was March 2021, and here we are 32 months later. For the longest time, I thought these interventions were crushing our innovations and ruining the integrity of all of the co-design that went into this questionnaire. And this was deeply difficult for me, and this led to burnout and depression. And so I took 3 weeks off to recover. And during that time, I came to see that scaling co-design, especially in a government context, includes the highest decision makers, because this is how our democracy remains accountable to the people. I came to see that the value of doing the 3-week co-design was not diminished just because of the work that came after to refine and improve the questionnaire. I used to think that co-design was only the 3-week part, but to scale means to bring key deep innovations to a wider audience. And I know there are practitioners that believe what I used to believe, who protect the definition and integrity of co-design dearly, and they still may disagree with this entirely. And if they were in my shoes and had a do-over, they might not have done the co-design, because the employees ultimately never had decision-making power over the questionnaire. But even through these changes, the key innovations remain. And I believe that these innovations would not have occurred if we hadn't done the co-design engagement at the onset. As always in co-design, setting expectations is key. And working with public servants for public servants made that easier, because they understand the context in which we work. Will they be disappointed in the final result? Only time will tell. I know I was disappointed at first, but for myself and our key stakeholders and our employees, I think they will come to see how each intervention was needed to ultimately serve the objectives of self-identification. In government, co-design participants are never going to hold ultimate decision-making power, but without aiming high and going deep, we would not have innovated. Which leads me to quote the cheesy but reflective quote by Oscar Wilde: "Shoot for the moon. Even if you miss, you'll land among the stars." So thank you for attending my talk, and I look forward to answering your questions and engaging with this community further.